Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Adam Golov, Marketing and Communications Manager at Data Conversion Laboratory, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I want to let you know we will allow time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. So please write your questions in the chat area as they come to mind. If we don't have time to answer them all, we will make them available on our website. Next slide, please. For those of you who are not familiar with DCL, we convert and organize content to create electronic documents, populate databases, publish on the web, and basically get it ready for tomorrow's technology. Next slide, please. DCL Services help you refine your document conversion strategy, identify document redundancy, extract metadata, and transform legacy and future documents for real needs, today and in the future. Next slide, please. Hey, Don, can you change the slide? I'm sorry.
I have.
Okay.
And I hope we're not.
There we go. Sorry about that, everyone. DCL serves a very broad client base. Next slide, please. Spanning all industries. Next slide, please. Today we are thrilled to introduce Don Day, founding chair of the OASIS DITA Technical Committee. Don is a content engineer with deep experience on innovative authoring solutions and information architectures for structured semantic content for the web and across the enterprise. He has led enterprise innovation efforts for more than 20 years, resulting in multiple patents, official recognition for his contribution to re-engineering IBM's information assets, and designation as an OASIS Distinguished Contributor for his efforts convening and leading the OASIS DITA Technical Committee. Don provides consulting on strategy, technology, and best practices for optimizing the value and usefulness of unstructured data. Without further ado, welcome Don.
Well, thank you very much, Adam. And the particular topic of discussion here today is something I've been working with very closely, tied in with all of that great background that Adam gave. I have been working with structured content and with making unstructured content mobile and accessible. And so this discussion is basically an investigation into ways of taking some of your usage of this DITA structured content a step further with going mapless with DITA. And I've subtitled it Lessons from the School of Practical Experience. My Twitter title, if you want to reach me, is @DonRDay, and my website for my business is learningbyrote.com. And we do have a hashtag of DCL webinar that you may use today. I've identified a couple salient things as quotes that you may want to tweet as you see them come by. So what are the motivations for today? I wanted to get at some of the myths and the moments that are possible for DITA. Among the myths are this small list here, but there's certainly some things that concern me that tend to make our expectations of DITA's usage more constrained than maybe it should be. For example, there's a notion that DITA is primarily for TechCom. While that's certainly the sweet spot for DITA, it's by no means the only way that it can be used. And I think that if you check into government, military, even other industries that are out there, DITA is not being used only for TechCom type content, but also for engineering data, for biometrics information, and much more where it's actually driving the business more than just being information about a product. Another myth about DITA is that it's defined by concept, task, and reference. While that is certainly the way that DITA was first introduced to the world, those are simply three specializations that represent information architecture based on minimalism that happens to fit very well with the TechCom community. So there's kind of a synergy there, but this is by no means the only information architecture that's possible with DITA. If you're familiar with DITA, you know that it's based on, at the very top, a map and a set of topics. very plain topics that can be specialized in any particular way that you need to. And so there's ample opportunity for specializing the topic to a vastly different set of roles besides just the minimalized information architecture for concept, task, and reference. So these do not define DITA. The architecture of DITA is its defining characteristic, the architecture for specialization. Another comment has been that DITA is too complex and has too many tags. That's certainly true of the full-blown implementation of DITA if you include every specialization in it. But in fact, the base DTD for DITA without any domains or specializations added to it actually has about the same number of elements as HTML. This has always been a design point for DITA. And as HTML has grown to HTML5 and adds more elements, DITA has grown in somewhat the same way, but less expansively, I'll say, in the base form, because DITA simply adds new architectural elements, whereas HTML has had to add new domain-specific elements. DITA adds its domain-specific elements by specialization, so you can always tune and adapt the number of elements that are actually available to any particular application. And you should use as many as you need, but no more. It's not a matter of too many tags, but how well have you adapted your application to the tags that make sense for your organization. I'll point out, looking ahead here, that I'll be doing another webinar for DCL in April when we'll be talking about the relationship of DITA and HTML5. So keep an eye on that, and Adam will certainly be sending out information about that as time comes. And a final myth is that DITA requires a CMS. This is one of those situations where DITA works very well with a CMS, in particular with a component content management system, but it doesn't require a CMS, and you can certainly start a very simple DITA project with a file-based system. And if you have the mechanisms to manage how you're creating content and tracking it, such as a simple spreadsheet, there's by no means a requirement for using a CMS. And so these things need to be said because they tend to be accepted as the defining characteristics of DITA, when in fact they are probably better considered as applications of DITA that tend to be very popular, just to put it one way. On the other hand, what we've got coming forward in this talk is the opportunity to look for new moments for DITA to be adopted and taken in new directions. Some of those moments include lightweight knowledge capture, as in knowledge capture in an organization of subject matter experts. Collections based on local metadata, that could be like requesting topics by author, by category, and so forth. Another way of using DITA is by single topics requested based on information that's in them. And that's usually the case with recipes. You don't read all of a recipe book. You go look for a single recipe and pull it out and use it. The same could be said for collectibles. When you're looking at a page of Pinterest, for example, each pin represents a single semantic component in that could be a DITA topic. Things like terms in a glossary are simply standalone for use in other applications and need to reference the terms. And another moment that we're looking forward to for DITA usage is the ability to defer your customization of the content from build time, where an author has pre-selected the way it's going to appear, to search time, where the reader, based on information that the application knows about them at that time, can customize the content for their view. We're going to be looking more closely at that now. And then finally, direct web publishing, as in every page is page one articles. DITA has no intrinsic features that prevent it from being used this way, and it's certainly something that we can look forward to in finding some more best practices on as time goes on. The activities here then are largely based on explorations that I've been doing using an open source toolkit called Expedita. I call it open source. Portions of it are already out there if you follow this link, and my aim is to, it's been on AIM for several years now, get it out real soon now, but I'm closer than ever. So we'll keep an eye on this, and hopefully later this spring we'll see something emerge that becomes something that the community can use. So we'll start off with some perspectives on context, and that involves the difference between wayfinders and place finders. A wayfinder is something that says, where am I going? The picture that you're looking at here is of a stick chart used by Polynesian islanders, and it doesn't depict places on a map. Rather, it depicts things that are characteristics of the environment that you're sailing in, like the wave height, current direction, wind direction, all features that from the background of knowledge you have of the sea gives you an idea of which way and how you may aim your boat to get to another destination somewhere further down the route. So it's not a map or a guided tour of destinations as in where to go, but it's more about what are the ways to go. And in practical examples today, you may have heard the term dead reckoning or foraging for content on the web, sometimes ending in serendipitous finds. Those are examples of wayfinding. But on the other hand, you may need to know, where am I? And for that you need tools like these. That would be the sextant, which allows you to find your latitude. That's how far north or south you are of the equator. The chronometer, which measures how far east or west you are of the prime meridian, so that gives you your longitude. And a compass, which gives you a direction or a vector relative to magnetic north. And so with these tools, you can determine where I am. Literally, it's GPS coordinates. And so it represents my relationship to points of interest that I want to go to. You may create a sequence of points you want to visit when you're doing trip planning, for example. Typically, we don't hit the road and then decide where to stay along the way. We plan those stops in advance and set up our hotels and so forth. Geocaching is another GPS-related activity we're familiar with, where you can stash some trinket or thing in a hidden place and then give someone else the opportunity using their GPS tool to locate it by coordinates. And a great gaming fun for the family if you've never tried it. And in looking at things from another point of view, it even applies to astronomy, where the GPS can give you, indicate where's the ground point that you want to be at if you want to see a particular satellite passing overhead. So in effect, the places that we think of as places we want to go to are URLs that represent the destinations in our lives. So it's time to just take a step back now and say, what is context anyway? We've got a couple definitions that we'll take a look at here. One is from the user-centered design point of view, where you may have heard context is everything. A very good quote that I've seen is in the Simpler is Better blog, where the blogger says, Ian Barker, we must ground our work in a rich understanding of the context of use, or else we run the risk of creating well-meaning rubbish. Say that 5 times fast. The sense is not lost on us, though, that if we simply develop content without context, then very likely that content will have little meaning once someone finally arrives at it. We want to try to avoid that. And with a little bit of design, we can do that. Another way we can look at it is by a business process definition, where context is defined as the background, the environment, the framework, setting, or situation surrounding an event or occurrence. That's a prescient definition because it actually has some structure to it, and we'll go take a look at that structure. When we dissect it, we see that the author mentioned the background, environment, framework, setting, or situation. And those are the contexts that have unique characteristics or properties. It would be things like the people you're around, or the event that you're in the midst of, or the season that you're in the midst of, and things of that nature. The environment, the setting. And then the word surrounding implies that there's some temporal or spatial cues that we'll be able to derive from this context. An example of a surrounding would be if an application provides a reading sequence for the content or provides a location for you to go to. And then the event or the occurrence is the triggering condition or something that triggers the opportunity for doing that activity. And more about that, when we look at it in daily life, context involves sensors that provide data to a system. We're surrounded by data and we interact with systems all the time. So an example of such a system would be the thermostat that you have in your house. You set it for a certain temperature. When the temperature drops below it, the heater comes on. When the heat in the house rises high enough, the thermostat switches off the heater and goes back to a waiting mode. So this is a sensor-involved setting, the temperature that you set, and something in the thermostat, the thermometer in the thermostat, is sensing whether the temperature is higher or lower than that setting. Toasters, likewise, you set a toaster for a certain amount of time, and when the time elapses, the toast pops up. When you flush the toilet, then the activity ceases once the toilet is full. So these are all examples of systems that have these implicit little value-based triggering systems that turn things on and off based on the context. When you're browsing a web page, you may have encountered the term responsive web design, and that would be a page in which, as you shrink it, the content reflows in order to adapt to the new width of the frame that you've given it. And so this is based on something called CSS media queries and device queries that are able to redirect the activity of the style sheet based on the characteristics of the design of the device that the information is being shown on. It is very much a system that has sensors and actuators in it. And in fact, any profile-based activity, when you log into a website and it starts to activate based on your profile, like when you log into LinkedIn, then what you've done is defined or limited the interactions that you want to receive from that website that you've logged into. So in life, it turns out that everything we do is based on some level of indirection, and everything that we link to is based on some kind of a key. When you're navigating through a table of contents on a website, you're actually navigating through a list of linked keywords, and each of those links is an independent. You might say that the endpoint of the URL is pointing to an endpoint that you want to get to. Everything else in the URL is simply part of the URL that helps the browser get you to that endpoint. When you're searching, you end up with a string of hits that match the search request that you've got, and those matches are strings that are in these endpoints. So again, it's the endpoint. The string was simply a key to that endpoint. In a faceted search, you usually have a set of increasingly narrow things to select on. If you've been to a ordering site, like for ordering clothing, or even Amazon.com, you're typically dealing with faceted search in a navigator on the left-hand side that helps you to increasingly narrow down on the selection that you want to get to. And in that case, you've got a sequence or a list of focused terms that represent the endpoint that you're going to arrive at. And even in context-sensitive help, this becomes more specific. The previous ones were things that create collections of information. When you have a one-to-one relationship between a piece of information and the context that calls it, then you're dealing with the resource identifier directly. And you might think of the program itself as actually containing the list because each component in the program may link to a different piece of help panel. So in DITA, what is a context? A context is the element property that can be acted on by the processing filters. This is kind of a high-level explanation or a definition, but more specifically, it would be the attributes in an element that have values like audience equal manager or product equal typewriter. So the properties are the things that provide handles for logic in the application to act on. The filters are the DITA val rules, and they allow you to be able to express conditions like if audience equals manager, then do something with this content. These element properties, if you're familiar with DITA, can be modified in two ways. One is by the direct map context that it's in, where topic picks up its eventual final property from the cascade of topic metadata properties above it in the document tree. And then branch-based filtering, which allows DITA val conditions to happen on the content referenced in different branches of the map. In this case, you're changing how the keys are resolved in different parts of the map. And then elements with properties that match a rule can be processed in two ways in DITA. One is they can be filtered, or they set up filtering, which means that the application will either selectively include or exclude that content that matches, or that content can be flagged, which simply means that you can adorn it stylistically to make it stand out based on it matching that condition. You can highlight it, you can put an image in front of it. It's just some way of making it stand out when it happens to be the salient feature that you want to look for. So the net of this page is that conditional processing effectively removes some selection from the user, and therefore it's removing context from them. And because of that, in a typical built environment, this leads to a problem for users who find themselves by search or whatever mechanism in the middle of such content. And that's what I call the fourth wall dilemma. There's a delightful quote from the movie The Box Trolls. If you haven't seen it, I don't have stock in the movie, but I recommend it. It's fun for all ages, and has a wonderful outtake at the end during the closing credits where these characters are talking to each other and saying, could you imagine if someone outside of us is actually moving our fingers and making me hold my fingers up like this? And they go through different machinations, and as the camera pulls back, you see the animators moving the figures frantically. And his friend replies, and this is very much as applied to maps, I think it throws out notions of free will. So your map constrains the free will that the user might have, and it leads us to be able to say, well, how can we move beyond that? Well, when we reach a fork in the road like that, there's usually reasons for going one way or the other, and we'll look at that. So on each of these paths, we see that there are some characteristics of it. On the compile path, the map is the context. On what we're going to call the grab-and-go path, the environment is the context. On the compile path, your topic properties are derived and mutable during the processing time. Whereas on the grab-and-go path, they have to be immutable because you're going to retrieve them based on their known value in the context that they're in. And then finally, in the compile path, your deliverables are in multiple versions in order to anticipate multiple use cases. You may say that this is providing different versions of free will, but ultimately they're very canned cases of free will. Whereas in the grab-and-go path, resources can be rendered according to the properties in them for getting the right information to the right person at the right time and in the right selection of content. So we're very familiar with the compile path if you've been working with DITA before, but you may be very curious about what's on the grab-and-go path. A destination for grab-and-go path is typically a microsite. All of these are actually examples of microsites, but when web designers are talking about a microsite, they're usually talking about this first experience. When you go shop for a car, you land on a typically a manufacturer, and then drill down to a particular model of a car. And once you jump to that link, you find yourself in a website where that model is actually part of the domain name, and your experience within that subset of the website is all about that car model, everything that you need to know about it, the specifications, the experience, how it compares with other models. And this can be done for genres of music, can be done for movies and plays. These are each examples of microsites where the information is prepared specifically for one product or service or type of user request. We see it in entertainment where branded information tends to create an island of links and sites that you visit. Other examples of grab-and-go destinations would be websites that serve strictly as calculators for finding the cost of something, or comparators for comparing different models of laptop that you may be shopping for, configurators that help you set up a website or a product, and troubleshooters that help you walk through figuring out what's wrong with a particular product that you're using. And then many times a microsite is used for consumer education and raising awareness of issues. Right now in the season of the U.S. Presidential elections coming up, you may have already visited microsites for one of the major candidates and all the information that's about them. Another type of grab-and-go destination would be sites like medium.com that represent long-form reading, or news magazines or news aggregators. There are sites for gamers, sites for collectors, sites for hobbyists, and sites for fans. What characterizes all of these is that they tend to represent collections of lore or information that's key to that particular set of visitors that come to the site. There are emergency preparedness playbooks that may be used by your city or state, or even the U.S. FEMA has such playbooks, and they represent how you would respond to natural disasters, fires, and accidents. And just for fun, if you want to take a look, just Google for zombies and CDC, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, and see how they've created a microsite based on a zombie infection, a zombie invasion, as an example of emergency preparedness. A wonderful example of a microsite. Other how-to sites that you may have visited include WikiHow or iFixit if you've broken a screen on your iPad and need to repair it, about.com, and many, many others, even cooking sites. Wikis are another example of a microsite or a grab-and-go destination where the intent of the site is to allow subject matter experts to record their knowledge or provide for agile team collaboration. So if there's any one characteristic of all of these sites, it's that they generally provide an aggregation of standalone topics. You typically won't find a map for any of them, but rather their properties will allow them to be sorted and aggregated and searched on to find the one that applies to you. So what are some of the methods for mapless contexts? A mapless context will generally have a loosely coupled architecture. And what that will allow is, on one hand, rich selection of the greatest affordance of the facets, the descriptors, and the content that users will be looking for. It will allow deep searchability because generally search is a way that you can pass live selection filters directly to the content that you want to find. And then it allows application of context-modified views to the result, both to a map and to a topic. And we'll be using the term adaptable content for that. When you have mapless content, you're able to resolve it in the browser, for example, where the XML is available in the browser for JavaScript to operate on. And there are several good examples of that that are out there. It allows you to alternatively resolve the content on the server, where the reason for doing it that way would be to optimize your bandwidth and the ability to cache the content between views that are of the same kind, which you wouldn't be able to do if you were resolving the content in the browser. Either way, you're retrieving a single topic and then rendering it for presentation to a particular user's requirements. And Another way of looking at these is that they're state machines that are sitting there and watching for actionable signals. Keep in mind the thermostat, for example. So state machine, what is that? DITA files are actually examples of state machines. A state machine uses inputs to determine when to change states and call new behaviors. So a case of a DITA entry would be that line in black where the attribute is product, the val is extended prod, and the action is exclude. When you read that in a human readable form, what that really is saying is if the value of the current element's product attribute is extended prod, then exclude the element. And you can see that it has a condition, it has a value that has to meet that condition, and then it has an action that's performed when those two things that you see within the parentheses are both true, then you can do the final thing. So with mobile devices, and contextual data will include geolocation, time, velocity, direction. Those are things that show up on your GPS when you're traveling in a car, for example, in navigation mode. It may include image and biometric processing. When it applies to a user profile, then it will be using data in your bookmarks file or in your browse history or in any contact list that you've got. Or it may be as a result of responses you've had to a form. So the overall takeaway here on state machines is that in regards to Mapless Data, it's simply moving state-based behaviors from fixed views in the defined map and the build tools closer to where the user is actually going to interact with that content. How do we do that? When you take a look at a DITA topic, you see that it has internal context already defined for it. About half of the elements in DITA are content-specific elements within the body of the topic, but within the prologue are a whole slug of other elements that represent the metadata that can be applied directly to that topic. Those include things like the creation date, the author, the status, category. There's just a number of metadata elements available in DITA. But there are also indirect properties associated with the content, and that would be things like the IDs or the keywords that associate that topic to other collections. That would be the category, the resource ID, the publisher, series, and source. And I misstated something. Both of these lists are lists that are part of the internal prologue. It's just that some of the properties are direct properties and others are indirect because they allow that topic to be associated with a group of like topics. Topics also have context by proxy, and so that would be saying that the domain of use may include context-dependent intent. Take the software industry, for example. When you're reading a software document and you see a term in italics, that nearly always signifies a variable in that context. Whereas in a journal article, when you see a phrase in italics, it may represent either simple highlighting, emphasis in that context, or it may actually indicate a foreign term that's been italicized per style guidelines. And so each of those contexts are different, and that's an example of context-dependent intent on the markup. Your artifacts of user curation may apply as a context as well. The bookmark files you created, any known prior reuse that you've done may inform on how an application may reuse that information in the future. When we talk about prior reuse, for example, when you do a search, oftentimes the list that you get back is ranked by popularity or the number of times that you visited a site. And so if you had that same information based on the number of times that you've reused content, then that becomes contextually important information for possible future uses. When someone goes to inquire information about, goes to display a topic and the conref is resolved based on popularity of a target rather than an absolute direction to it. I'm really thinking ahead here, and don't try to wrap your head around current processing based on that. We're talking about creating moments and new opportunities for DITA here. There's another principle of organization that has been used by Richard Saul Wurman, popular industrial designer, who has come up with the acronym LATCH, which stands for length, alphabet, time, category, and hierarchy, all the primary ways that we typically organize information. And because these are categories, they allow us to group information by any or some combination of these categories in order to further refine the information that we're trying to get at. These are examples of context by proxy. So context can also be provided by queries and parameters. And real quickly on this, a URL, when you're looking at it, may have values in the URL like size, large, color, blue, which are part of the URL itself. Or you may have seen URLs that have this question mark with more programmatic looking information following that question mark, size equal large and color equal blue. That's a parameter query in web language. And when you log in to a website, you're actually passing your login information through a method called a post, which is a less obvious way of passing information to an application about what you want to do at that site. The question mark method, or the query, parameter query, is actually a mechanism that many CMSs use in order to identify specific targets of information within their CMS. And here, the information that you see within the curly brackets are simply parameters that could be fitted into a URL in order to come up with a topic that was created at a particular date and a time by a particular author and with a particular file name. Just a way of drilling down to the specific information within the CMS, and we may ask, why can't we make that possible for authors to use as well, for readers rather. So in effect, the URL parameters provide a context that applies stateful views to the resource. A topic can insert itself if you will follow these best practices. Fill in the appropriate data in a prologue, use the appropriate markup if available. Consider using indexing and keywords because these help improve the context by which a search can pull up the more specific content you may be looking for. In effect, all the keywords and indexing that you put into a topic provide additional facets that at search time can be used to help resolve the relevance of the retrieved topic that you're going after. And finally, use DITA's search title element because it's a way of providing very SEO-specific terms to the search engine for it to use when you look at search results. You want readers to pick up the topic based on the things that you hope that they're looking for rather than on whatever popular title that you may have put on it to make your topic stand out from the sea of hits. The roll-up from this discussion is that you want to select markup for what something is and not for how it makes something appear. This is just good, smart sense for DITA authors. So finally, reviewing Mapless Data, its use of topics that are self-descriptive or semantically rich, its contexts that are defined to trigger the events that a reader may have for selection, and its processing that operates on that selected content. And then finally, it's a philosophy of thinking about the environment itself as the map that provides these conditions for the reader. A topic in Mapless Data, again, because this is a review, I'll just go quickly through it, that it's the properties that are in it that allow it to move beyond the map-based builds to contextually based lookup on the topic. A context in Mapless Data is any kind of information that takes the role of a map for being able to infer whether that topic is part of a collection or whether there's a dynamic relationship from that topic to other of its peers in the collection of information. It allows ranking by relevance, and it allows topics that likely targets for conref resolution, for example. and I'm watching the time here because I think there may be a lot of questions on some of this. So I'll just move to coming back to the state machine, which is simply logic based on values. In a state machine, you've got processing that's based on specific applications, and your application is going to be lighter weight than a standard DITA build. This is simply a necessity that we're using information in a more straightforward way and don't have the full context that a rich DITA map may have, but there's still a wide realm of application that could be made for content based on this lighter weight processing. Typically, you'll only be involved with delta processing on the application's expectations, and you should always have an override for the standard processing templates. This is DITA 101, but applies to topics in the whole spectrum of complexity, from simple topics to complex topics where build systems are needed to process them. And even then, with a library of standard processing templates, it sheds light on the amount of processing that would be unused anyway. What this means is that in a typical template that's processed, typical topic that's processed, probably 90% of the templates that are available for handling elements are never called on it. And this is just saying that in a Mapless Data environment, it really is possible to trim the scope of the application down to the level of complexity that you're actually offering to the user. And the environment for Mapless Data can be described this way. I really love these words. I learned them as a Spanish dicho, but in English the words mean, in this treacherous world, nothing is truth or lie. Everything depends on the color of the glass through which one looks. I think that applies to maps because when we think of it, a map is a context, but queries are context, and user profiles are context, and ultimately everything is context, and context is everything. So reflecting on all of this, is this a case of building yet another DITA toolkit? I don't think it is. One thing I've often talked about in my blog, the DITA Per Day blog, is that it's possible to use DITA in a lightweight manner, and that's an example of Mapless Data. It's no different from vendors who bring their competitive features to market. We're just bringing a lighter set of features to opportunity to use it. The content that you create should be processable in any environment, but we're just creating a lighter weight environment where the topic doesn't require the map for its context. So the question is, does Mapless Data solve a problem? And if it does, then, and it's a problem that only you have, then it may be time for you to get your groove on and try Mapless Data. But I offer it with this proviso: your application, your intent should be to make things as simple as necessary, but not simpler. And I've called this Einstein's razor instead of Occam's razor, dulled by my interpretation of it. There are some Mapless Data efforts out there. I mentioned them earlier. Right now I'm supporting an application called TLO Wiki. TLO stands for the language of. If you've seen a book that has been offered at TechCom conferences called The Language of Content Strategy, that was authored on an original version of a wiki set up by Dick Hamilton of XML Press. I've since, with Dick, worked on creating an Expedita-based wiki site for creating subsequent versions of that in that series. We're working right now on the language of technical content and the language of business storytelling as examples where we've used a term topic specialization that actually sets up form-based editor for many authors to participate in creating their separate chapters on, and then rolling up and allowing the facilitators, the site admins, to finish creating the book out of it. I'm calling it a Mapless Data effort because each author approaches their topic based on accessing it by their name or by their term value. They're generally unaware of the fact that there's a map that brings it all up into a table of contents. But that's a production-based requirement and by no means defines the fact that individuals approach the site based on metadata and the topic rather than by the map for accessing the topic that they're working on. There is an application called Dynamic Data Document Display. Chris Despopoulos is the author of that, and it's a demo site where you can actually experience using a browser-based application. So when you visit the site, the transformations are happening in your browser rather than at the server. A very interesting application, and I encourage you to look at it. Then there's an activity going on called Lightweight DITA. The OASIS DITA Technical Committee is now looking forward to requirements for DITA 2.0, and this is a activity that helps to feed into requirements gathering for that, and is also very much in the role of looking at uses of DITA that go beyond the standard applications. And so it's focused much more on looking at applications that haven't been touched by the standard authoring tools and standard build tools. The links that you'll have here will take you to more information about that, and I encourage you to look at it, and if you're interested, you're certainly welcome to join the activity and help contribute to the discussion. So with that, we come to questions, and I'll turn this over to Adam.
Thank you, Don. A very informative webinar. The first question that has come in is, who is doing Mapless Data today?
I'll actually just take you back and point to these as some of the Mapless Data efforts. It's hard to tell when someone is actually using, whether they're actually using a map or not behind their application. No one has told me that they're creating Mapless Data applications, and the only way you would know really is either from seeing that it's primarily query driven for getting at the content rather than table of contents driven. I would say that that would be the distinguishing characteristic of it. It doesn't mean it can't have a table of contents, but it means it's not, that's not the primary way of accessing the information in it. Frankly, Adam, what I'd like to encourage is that if anyone actually knows of a Mapless Data application, let me know, because I'd like to make this information more available. And I do have a Yahoo group called DITA Wiki, just like DITA Users, only it's DITA-Wiki, and would encourage folks to use that to discuss any applications they've seen of DITA used maplessly, either in their organization or something they've observed out in the wild.
Will do, Don. Thank you, Don, for that answer. The next question is there a community of discussion about this topic?
Well, I think I actually mentioned it there. There is the DITA Wiki forum on Yahoo Groups. It's been lightly used in the past, but I think this is a good opportunity to have some of that discussion there. And as well, I'll point back to the lightweight DITA activity. In particular, if you're interested in helping to move the community forward and where DITA is going to go design-wise, this would be what you want to look at. The DITA Wiki community would be a place where we can talk about what you can do today. Present-looking DITA Wiki forum, future-looking lightweight DITA.
Excellent. Thank you, Don. The next question is, doesn't this Mapless DITA concept further complicate an already complex authoring system?
How should we answer that? The way that I look at it is that if you have a need for using DITA, if you have a set of users who are using DITA that the standard DITA tools are too expensive for based on the amount of use that they're able to give them, you may be starting to look at an opportunity for using Mapless Data. So by that I mean typically when you purchase an XML editor for DITA, you're spending several $100s for a license for it. And because of that investment, you want to use it as much as possible. This sort of investment makes perfect sense for technical writers, but it may not make sense for someone working in an agile programming team who's charged with doing API documentation, and they do one API per day, maybe an hour a day of use on it. So they're underutilizing the investment in that editor, and it certainly should raise the question of what would be the appropriate tool for them to use. So my answer to that question would be that the level of use that you intend for it may very well direct you toward looking for a solution in the Mapless Data area where you're not really competing with the tools that are out there anyway because they are not exactly suitable for the task that your writer has. It's a complicated question, but my opinion is that we're not seeing greater adoption of DITA primarily because the tools that have been created for that sweet spot in TechCom are not optimized for audiences outside of TechCom. They can certainly be adapted for it, but whether they are the most cost efficient or the most user community efficient is another question. So it's a different set of tools, it's a different set of considerations. This would be thinking about someone in a content marketing department at a company, small company, that's simply trying to create content for a website, but they want to be able to create smart content that's adaptive for the responsive web design that they've got on their website. As differentiated from someone who's documenting a product and needing to create a set of warranted information for that product. I hope that answers the question, Adam.
Yes, thank you. The next question has come in is, does Mapless Data work with XML editors such as Oxygen?
Oh, certainly would, because you could take any standard data topic and the understanding is that you're simply creating it with the foresight not to put things into it that could only be rendered in a full build environment. And there's actually quite a bit of latitude when you look at it that way. On the fly, what examples could I give of that? A dependency on build would be if the value that's resolved for a conref could only be obtained by processing it in a map with a branch filter, for example. That may be an extreme example, but that would be one. And a simple example would be if the condition can be expressed in a simple DITA value that can be handled at runtime if you simply stream the content through a filter before you display it.
Excellent. Thank you, Don. The last question has come in is, will I be able to represent a topic in many different ways as I can with DITA 1.3 branch processing and multiple DITA val files?
Well, so again, it's the case of complexity of processing requirements where for a topic to be fully resolved in that environment, you have to process the map and typically need to process all the peer topics that will have an influence in the final resolved value of that topic. That makes it so that this is not something you can do by processing a single topic on the fly. On the other hand, if your environment provides the information that you need to feed into the processor for that topic, it may be that you can do things as complex as based on who the user logged in as, what role they logged in as, so that you have that information, what display characteristics they prefer so that you can render it in the right format. Thinking off the top of my head, it would be any characteristics like that that are very dynamic in the environment that they're in that can be applied to the on-the-fly rendition of that topic. But my suspicion is that if you're processing a topic in light of a map in a certain DITA file on a certain branch of a map-based document, that the overhead for processing would be too complicated for trying to do that in an on-the-fly fashion that had a responsive processing time. This is very much about on-the-fly processing too, so I hope that that's understood.
Great. Thank you, Don. We had one last question that came in, and it is, can Mapless Data give you more flexibility in what it means to publish?
That's certainly the intent I had in the saying that we're looking for moments for data. When I think about some of the new business opportunities for rolling data out, I think about, for example, the kinds of mail, advertising mail or other kinds of mail that you pick up in your mailbox. Take a look at it, and if any of it has substantive content in it, you can start asking the question, who created that content? Would their lives have been simpler if they could have done it using DITA for a neighborhood association newsletter, for example, or for information coming from your a newsletter from your local elected official. So it is going to depend on the context. No one can tell you what you can or can't do with it. It's going to be based on a need that you see and asking the question, would DITA make sense in this case? And this all falls back to my observation at the beginning that many times the way we think about DITA in standard use limits our ability to think about it in new usage opportunities. And so that would be my closing call on this, Adam, is simply saying think about DITA as an architecture, and it's looking for new ways to be applied. So when I talk about Mapless Data, all I'm really saying is think outside the box, think of ways that you can make your content more responsive to a user whose requirements, both to a user and to an author, whose requirements may be much simpler and may not even require that it be map-based for access, and certainly content on a website, a business website, or any of the sample microsites that I mentioned would be very good examples of use cases for Mapless Data.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Don, and thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. This will conclude today's broadcast. You will be able to access the recorded version of this webinar in the Webinar Archive section of our website located at www.dclab.com. Also, our next webinar will be Tuesday, February 23rd at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, titled Digitizing Your Legacy Data, More Than Just OCR, presented by Nave Greenberg, Director, U.S. Defense Development at DCL. Thank you again, everyone, for attending, and have a great day.
Thank you.